Welcome back. So let's talk about how the Part 2 regulations are changing, because they are changing. So Part 2 changed in 2017, it changed again in 2018, it changed again in 2020, and it's likely going to change again in 2023. So the general framework, though, has not changed. Written patient consent is still required for most disclosures. So we're going to go over some of these things, an overview of the CARES Act, amendment to the 42 CFR Part 2, which is under 42 USC 290DD-2. We'll talk about the 2020 final rule, the 2018 final rule, and the 2017 final rule. The 2020 final rule is like just the statement and analysis. The 2018 and 2017 final rule is what substance use treatment providers need to know. So many partners in the patient advocacy and recovery communities have really just opposed weakening that long established federal confidentiality protections for SUD information in Part 2 to conform with HIPAA. We didn't believe that, there were any legislative amendments to 42 USC 290DD-2 that were needed because the law sufficiently allowed for the exchange of information for the purpose of integrating behavioral health care with physical health care, and a goal that most partners supported. But it also protected critical patient privacy protections. Also, SAMHSA had recently updated the regulations that implement the law in 2017 and 2018 for the stated purpose of facilitating the coordination of care between SUD and other healthcare providers. So most of the people in the field really just opposed the provisions in the Senate's third coronavirus response bill, which the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, which was the CARES Act. And that amended existing federal confidentiality rules for SUD information in 42 USC 290DD-2. And it's implementing regulations 42 CFR Part 2, which we refer to as Part 2. So some in the field, they just maintain that any changes to these existing federal substance use disorder rules should have been considered and discussed at another time when the nation is not facing a crisis that's causing loss of life and widespread illness and economic distress. But nevertheless, despite the numerous concerns that were raised by people like the Legal Action Center and partners of them, the CARES Act did not include amendments to the SUD privacy rule. So while the CARES Act was signed into law in March 27, 2020, the amendments to the privacy law didn't take effect until HHS finalized its changes to the regulations at 42 CFR Part 2. So these amendments unequivocally weakened patient privacy safeguards, but they don't fully adopt the HIPAA privacy standard, and they contain some positive provisions. Most importantly, the amendments contain stronger enforcement mechanisms and new anti-discrimination requirements. But the CARES Act removes longstanding privacy protections when information is shared for treatment or payment and healthcare operations purposes, and it weakens the prohibition against the use of protected records in criminal investigations and prosecutions. Unlike some of the prior legislative proposals, the new law retains two very important requirements of the original confidentiality law and regulations. So one, voluntarily written patient consent is still required before any initial disclosure of substance use disorder records can be made for treatment or payment or healthcare operation purposes. And two, patients who sign those consent forms still have the right to revoke their consent to prohibit future redisclosures. I have put in the lesson underneath this video a summary of the changes to Part 2 in the CARES Act. So please do open that document and read it so you can really fully understand what changed. So the CARES Act in 2020, it amended the statute on which Part 2 is based. The regulations were not directly amended by the CARES Act. So there are questions raised regarding how it's going to be enforced. But that's going to be addressed by HHA. And a lot of people opposed the provisions of SAMHSA's August 26, 2019, their notice of proposed rulemaking, which formed the basis of the latest confidentiality of substance use disorder patient records final rule. It was Rule AA32, which we call the final rule. And this final rule was formally published in the Federal Register on July 15th, 2020, and it went into effect August 14th, 2020. And there were serious concerns about the changes that weakened that patient confidentiality protection for SUD records in favor of sharing information with law enforcement, insurance companies, other third parties who did not provide care. And as I discuss in more detail, the final rule expands law enforcement agencies' access to that confidential treatment record, and it allows law enforcement undercover agents on the premises of the treatment centers for longer periods of time than they were allowed to be there before. So there's a concern that these changes are going to discourage people from seeking or staying in treatment, particularly people living in areas that are already heavily policed, like Black and brown neighborhoods, immigrant communities, low-income neighborhoods. So there's a concern that the disparate impact of the final rule is going to undermine SAMHSA's initiative to advance behavioral health equity or compound existing disparities in access to treatment and health outcomes for communities of color. And it's going to lead to more unnecessary and harmful interventions with the criminal justice system. And instead of achieving the stated goals of the changes, facilitating coordination of care between SUD and overall health providers, I'm contending that the changes in the final rule and in the upcoming modifications to Part 2 required by the Senate's third coronavirus response bill, the CARES Act, is likely going to have the opposite effect. Many of the patients are going to be afraid to sign consent forms, allowing for us to share their SUD information with other healthcare providers, because they know that once they do, the information is no longer going to be protected. And for the first time since the confidentiality law was enacted in the 1970s, they're afraid. There's additional confusion among stakeholders, especially patients and families and providers, who are already having to grapple with the changes to Part 2 that were made in 2017 and 2018. There's a continued belief that no legislative amendments to Part 2 were needed because the law sufficiently allowed for that exchange of information, just for the purpose of integrating behavioral health care with the physical health care, while still protecting that privacy. But there were a lot of organizations that were opposed to those provisions in the CARES Act. But the CARES Act was signed into law in 2020 and took effect 1 year from that date. And then SAMHSA has to make their own changes to the privacy rule. So there's a summary of the changes to the final rule in the lesson for you to read, so please open that document and read it. But this was the second time that SAMHSA issued a final rule amending Part 2. The previous final rule amending Part 2 was issued in 2017 by SAMHSA in January of 2017. The January 2018 final rule is based on the Supplemental Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which they call SNPRM. So this synopsis just describes the changes that were made by the January 2018 final rule, which substance use disorder treatment providers should be prepared to address and it went into effect February 2nd, 2018. But I've provided a fact sheet for you guys to kind of look at, but it's not a complete review of the changes made by the 2018 final rule. So you should also review the new regulations in their entirety and consult, other places for future updates or sample forms or publications. The Legal Action Center is a good place to start with that for updates. So let's talk about the things that changed. The first thing that changed was the optional abbreviated notice of prohibition on redisclosure. So the notice of prohibition on redisclosure of patient identifying information still must accompany patients' written consent forms, but now the notice can be abbreviated to the following, where it says 42 CFR Part 2 prohibits unauthorized disclosure of these records. That's literally all it has to say. SAMHSA indicated it made this change in order to conform to standard free text space within electronics health record systems. But SAMHSA encourages Part 2 programs and other lawful holders using the abbreviated notice to discuss the requirement with those to whom they disclose the patient identifying information. The existing notice of prohibition on redisclosure is still permissible. And then the second thing is permitted disclosures within or with the written patient consent. So disclosures by lawful holders. Once the patients consent to a disclosure of their patient records for payment or healthcare operation purposes, lawful holders who receive these records pursuant to the patient consent may then further disclose the records as necessary to their contractors, their subcontractors, or their legal representatives in order to perform the payment or the healthcare operations functions that are designated on that consent form. But the notice of prohibition requirement, lawful holders must provide their subcontractors or their contractors or their voluntary legal representatives with a notice of prohibition on redisclosure. When it comes to reporting requirements, these lawful holders must require their contractors, their subcontractors, or their voluntary legal representatives to report any unauthorized uses or disclosures or breaches of that patient identifying information to the lawful holders. So there are types of permissible payment and healthcare operations activities. So a list of permissible activities that qualify as payment or healthcare operations can be found in the lesson or in a document on, I'll just provide it in the lesson. So SAMHSA clarified that this list is meant to illustrate the types of activities that qualify for the purposes of Section 2.33. It's not an exhaustive list, though. So there are some prohibitions of disclosures for healthcare treatment purposes. The disclosures to a lawful holder's contractors or subcontractors or their legal representatives are not permitted for activities that are related to the patient's diagnosis, their treatment, referral for treatment, or care coordination. There are contract provisions for disclosures for payment and healthcare operation purposes. So the lawful holder of the information who wishes to disclose that patient identifying information for payment or healthcare operations activities has to have a written contract or other legal instrument with their contractors or their subcontractors or their voluntary legal representatives, which says they are fully bound by Part 2 provisions when they receive the patient's substance use disorder information. So you have to have that written contract. And the lawful holders cannot disclose the patient identifying information without that contract in place. The deadline for the contract compliance was February 2nd, 2020, so we should all be in compliance by now. But contractors, subcontractors, legal representatives are not required to produce a copy of the written contract or the legal instrument before a Part 2 program releases any information. Also, one of the things that it addressed was audit and evaluation. So lawful holders can disclose patient identifying information in order to comply with an audit or an evaluation performed in compliance with Part 2. So the parties that are authorized to conduct an audit or evaluation of a Part 2 program or a lawful holder may disclose patient identifying information to a contractor, a subcontractor, or a lawful representatives for the purpose of carrying out the audit. But again, there needs to be that contract.